ceasefire with several preconditions. This speaks volumes. Russia seems to continue to choose war while we speak. Across the globe, people continue suffering from soaring food and fuel prices as the war continues to disrupt supply chains and destabilize international markets. Madam President, it is up to all of us now to defend the international peace architecture built on the UN Charter wherever it is threatened. It is in the interest of all of us to ensure that might does not make right, and internationally recognized borders are not moved through the use of force. The Nordic countries want to underline that every sovereign state must maintain its right to choose its own alliances and its legal defense and security arrangements. Madam President, we note the new agreement on the safe navigation in the Black Sea, which should be implemented without delay and without additional conditions. Despite the immeasurable hardships caused by Russian invasion, Ukraine continues to defend its freedom, its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The Nordic countries will stand by Ukraine in this as long as it is needed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Finland for the statement, and I now give the floor to Mr. Paul Beresford Hill, Permanent Observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations.
Madam President, at the outset I wish to thank the Presidency of Denmark for convening this meeting and for affording the Sovereign Order of Malta the opportunity to contribute to a critical discussion on the deepening humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Just over a month ago, we marked a somber milestone, 3 years since the escalation of this devastating conflict, 3 years of unrelenting suffering, forced displacement, and shattered lives. 3 years in which civilians have endured unspeakable hardship, needless bloodshed, life-altering injuries, the loss of their homes, their loved ones, and for many, a sense of hope. While responding to the present crisis is paramount, we must also, however, look to the future. A cessation of hostilities, however distant, must not find us unprepared. We must recognize that when guns are silent, the humanitarian toll will persist. The sheer scale of destruction, the economic devastation, and the deep societal fractures will not be undone overnight. Rebuilding shattered communities requires long-term commitment, combined effort, and above all, an enduring concern for human dignity. While scale and conditions are clearly different, it is worth recalling the beginning of the last century, when a war that ended amid retribution and economic humiliation fed the seeds of resentment that 2 decades later led to a conflict of far greater consequence and suffering. We should recall, too, that a phoenix arose out of those ashes. The foresight, commitment, and strategic genius of one nation, also caught in the conflict, led to the Marshall Plan that secured a prosperous future for nations that had battled each other. While on the other side of the world, General Douglas MacArthur saw to it that a decimated Japan would reinvent itself as both an ally and an economic powerhouse. The imagination and the skill that created the Bretton Woods system, however much it has now served its purpose, back then made a major contribution to reconstruction development and the one thing that war-ravaged populations want most: security. It is not too much to ask that we invoke a similar inspirational spirit of reconciliation when we consider a future Ukraine, when artillery no longer dots the landscape and drones are used for peaceful purposes. Madam President, in addressing the transcending humanitarian concerns of the Ukrainian people, the Sovereign Order of Malta wishes to highlight 6 key areas that we believe must be prioritized, drawing from the first-hand experience of our operational staff, both Ukrainians and volunteers from other countries, numbering over 40,000, who have been working on the ground in Ukraine over the past 3 years. Firstly, psychological support for those affected by war-related trauma must be both comprehensive and accessible. The invisible wounds of conflict, particularly among children and young adults, will endure long after the fighting subsides. Without sustained intervention, these scars risk becoming lasting barriers to healing, social cohesion, and stability. And those children, taken from their homes in the Ukraine, must be returned to their families. To do anything other than that would be absolutely inhumane. Second, the restoration of Ukraine's healthcare system is of paramount importance, requiring not only the reconstruction and effective operation of medical facilities, but also the guaranteed availability of medicines, supplies, and support. The creation of a network of national emergency storage centers, according to our colleagues in Ukraine, will be vital to ensuring that those in need, whether urgent or routine care, receive timely and adequate treatment. Thirdly, the extensive destruction of homes and civilian infrastructure demands a coordinated and sustained rebuilding effort. Beyond simply restoring houses, we must facilitate the safe and dignified return of displaced families. Millions of them. This necessitates urban development plans that prioritize sustainability, accessibility, and long-term resilience. Essential services, electricity, water, transportation, must be fully reinstated to ensure communities can function and thrive. Fourth, the land must be restored, made habitable, and it must be protected. The detritus of war must be cleared away, destroyed, damaged military vehicles, ammunition still littering the fields, and of paramount importance, the danger of landmines must all be addressed. The international community must double its efforts to ensure the safety of nuclear installations, to prevent contamination and the dangers that arrive through poor maintenance and deliberate damage. The implications of this cannot be stressed enough, because they impact not only the health and welfare of Ukraine and Russia, but also neighboring countries. And fifthly, food and water security must be urgently addressed. Immediate humanitarian interventions are needed to ensure and restore reliable access to basic necessities, particularly in rural areas. At the same time, strategic efforts must be undertaken to revitalize Ukraine's agricultural sector, a cornerstone of its economic recovery and social stability. Ensuring the revival of agribusiness and local food production will be instrumental in preventing prolonged dependency on external aid. And lastly, education must be at the heart of the recovery effort. Schools are not merely places of learning, they are pillars of normalcy, of hope, and are the foundation of a better future. Learning programs must be widely implemented to facilitate a smooth return to schooling alongside structured socialization initiatives to help children and young people both process the traumas they have endured and to reintegrate their lives into a new society. Higher education, whether academic or vocational, is going to be critical in rebuilding a shattered economy. A new generation must learn the importance of turning guns into harvesters, of using critical thinking skills, not to outwit the enemy, but to outwit climate change.
And hindering their access to support services. Funding cuts are expected to further impact an estimated 640,000 women and girls in Ukraine, as vital gender-based violence services, psychosocial support, and safe spaces will no longer be continued, according to the UN Population Fund. In many areas, response efforts are led by the government of Ukraine, regional authorities, and Ukrainian first responders. The UN and its humanitarian partners continue to do their best, focusing on frontline communities, people forced to evacuate their homes due to increased violence, those mostly immediately impacted by attacks, and newly displaced people. So far in 2025, we have reached 1.7 million people with water and sanitation services, health care, food assistance, and shelter items. We have also delivered critical supplies to nearly 20,000 war-affected civilians in frontline communities through 14 interagency convoys. Some 660 humanitarian organizations, led by local NGOs, work amidst tremendous insecurity to provide civilians with the services and supplies they need to sustain their lives. Sadly, they have not been spared in this conflict. Already this year, 7 humanitarian workers have been injured in line of duty. Attacks also damaged humanitarian assets and facilities in the Kharkiv, Odessa, Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv, and Sloviansk regions, further hampering the response. Humanitarians, their facilities and assets must be protected and humanitarian relief operations facilitated. We are grateful to the donors who have so far provided 17% of the $2.6 billion needed for the 2025 Ukraine Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This has enabled us to address the most immediate impacts of the conflict and provide life-saving assistance. Recent funding cuts have led to a reprioritization of Ukraine response efforts that will be announced in the coming weeks. Continued financial support will be essential to maintain operations. Madam President, we are extremely concerned about the estimated 1.5 million civilians requiring assistance in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions under occupation by the Russian Federation. We remain unable to reach these people at any adequate scale. As we have said before, international humanitarian law requires all parties to allow and facilitate the swift and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian relief to civilians in need and ensure that humanitarian personnel have the necessary freedom of movement to perform their duties. We welcome further engagement with the parties to allow us to deliver aid safely to those in need wherever they are. Madam President, here is what we need from the international community. 1, insistence on compliance with international humanitarian law to protect civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarians, and ensure unimpeded humanitarian access to people in need. 2, funding to save as many lives as we can and sustain humanitarian operations in this complex and dangerous environment. And 3, an end to this war, and until then, sustained efforts to ensure that humanitarian needs are a central part of discussions on a pause in fighting or longer-term agreement. Thank you, Madam President.
I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of
Merci. Les attaques indiscriminées ont fait d'innombrables victimes parmi la population civile ukrainienne. Vous le disiez, selon le commissariat aux réfugiés, 3,7 millions de personnes ont été déplacées à l'intérieur du pays. Près de 7 millions ont cherché refuge en Europe et ailleurs. Les enfants ukrainiens paient un lourd tribut. Nombre d'entre eux ont été déportés vers la Russie, où ils sont soumis à des pratiques de rééducation forcée. Les personnes âgées et handicapées ainsi que les femmes persons and handicapped people, as well as women, are disproportionately affected by the Russian aggression. Russia has destroyed 2/3 of the productive capacity of Ukraine's energy grid. The suffering of the Ukrainian people have become more acute in recent days, as you were saying. Russia, including in Kyiv and Odessa, has staged strikes against energy infrastructure and civilian objects, including hospitals, schools and residential buildings. These indiscriminate strikes rather demonstrate the gaping disconnect that there is between Russia's words and actions. They said that they were ready for a partial ceasefire on energy infrastructure a few days ago. The deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian objects is a violation of international humanitarian law. These acts must cease immediately, regardless of any ceasefire, whatever its scope. We condemn these attacks. Madam President, Russia must demonstrate its desire for peace. Russia cannot claim that it is ready to establish a partial truce, while at the same time it continues to relentlessly shell Ukrainian civilians. Ukraine agreed immediately to a proposal for an immediate, comprehensive and unconditional ceasefire as proposed by the US during the meeting in Jeddah on the 11th of March. France hails this progress, just as we support all efforts that could help to move towards a just and lasting peace. And yet, far from demonstrating that Russia genuinely desires peace, Russia continues day after day to strike Ukrainian territory, including civilian targets. As I was saying, and every day there are new victims. There is a moratorium on energy infrastructure and the announcement of a Black Sea truce. And that is a step in the right direction, but it's not enough in terms of establishing a lasting ceasefire and must be followed up by action. Madam President, it is to build this just and lasting peace that France, with its European Union partners, will continue to stand at Ukraine's side. Since the 24th of February 2022, we've chosen to provide political support and humanitarian aid to the Ukraine. On January 1st, 2025, that support stood at €436 million and was support extended alongside that of UN agencies, international organizations and NGOs. We've also provided military support to Ukraine to help it exercise its right to self-defense, as enshrined in Article 51. This military support is designed to enforce law, to bring down an illegal war, as it has been termed by the ICJ. On the 16th of March, and ever since, the ICJ has called upon Russia to immediately suspend its military operations on Ukrainian territory. Ukraine must be able to defend itself, to be placed to engage in negotiations which will lead to a just settlement of the conflict. The European Council on the 20th of March reaffirmed the EU's determination to continue to support Ukraine and its population with comprehensive support. Ukraine is a sovereign nation and must be able to participate in negotiations which determine its fate. Nothing concerning Ukraine must be decided upon without Ukraine. Nothing that could possibly jeopardize Europe's security will be decided upon without Europeans being at the table. Security guarantees that are robust, which deter future aggressions, must be made available to Ukraine. France will remain engaged to achieve a just, lasting peace rooted in the principles of the Charter. These principles include the sovereign equality of states and respect for their territorial integrity, and they were reaffirmed by the General Assembly in 2 resolutions adopted on the 24th of February. These essential principles must continue to guide our efforts to achieve a just and lasting peace. Until we do that, the international community must continue to provide Ukraine with the humanitarian aid it needs. I thank you.
Thank the representative of France for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Panama thanks the presidency for convening this meeting to discuss the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. We also thank the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Joyce Masuya, for her invaluable briefing. She is also, of course, the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. Moreover, we recognize the presence of the representatives of delegations of Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, and from the European Union. They do us the great honor of being with us today. Panama notes with concern that as part of the conflict in Ukraine, like in other conflicts, attacks against the civilian population and critical infrastructure continue. Only a few days ago, in several cities in Ukraine, we saw attacks launched by missiles and drones, and there were many people killed, including children. The most recent attack occurred on the 24th of March in the city of Sumy. That attack injured 88 people, including 17 children, and civilian infrastructure was damaged. Panama reiterates that international humanitarian law clearly prohibits attacks against civilians. It also prohibits attacks against civilian infrastructure. Civilian infrastructure must always be protected at all times, anywhere and in any conflict. With that in mind, it is timely to underscore what was said in the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for the United Nations for Human Rights that was published on the 21st of March 2025. That report underscores the devastating effects of this conflict, which has brought with it tragic consequences for millions of children. Panama values the vital work done by UN humanitarian personnel and by other organizations providing the humanitarian assistance required. We remind all parties of their obligation to guarantee unfettered access so that this aid can directly reach those affected by the conflict. Madam President, it is vital that we see a total cessation of hostilities with immediate measures taken to restore peace in Ukraine. As such, and bearing in mind that maritime security is fundamental for Panama, we are optimistic when we note the steps that have been taken towards a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, such as to allow the safety of navigation. All efforts now must be focused on achieving the urgent goal that is ours through agreements which establish a cessation of hostilities, the resumption and delivery of urgent humanitarian aid, and a lasting peace. As such, Panama reiterates its support for the conversations underway in Riyadh. Their goal is to move to negotiations for conflict resolution. That must be focused on a just and lasting peace and be in line with the principles established in the UN Charter. Thank you.
Of Panama for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Masuya for the important updates provided and welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Finland, the European Union, and the Sovereign Order of Malta in today's meeting. Madam President, we take positive note of the intensification of efforts to bring about a permanent and sustainable ceasefire in Ukraine, and the announcement yesterday that an agreement has been reached on Black Sea navigation. Guyana has long emphasized the importance of dialogue and diplomacy in the international response to the war in Ukraine and commends the architects of these and other peace initiatives for their foresight and dedication. Even as we celebrate the modest breakthroughs, we continue to be reminded of the urgent need to bring this war to an immediate and permanent end. The recent drone attacks against energy and civilian infrastructure and the rising death toll over the past few weeks serve as a stark reminder that the shadow of destruction continues to loom large and can only serve to diminish the prospects for peace. This is a critical time where the slightest misstep could doom millions of Ukrainian and Russian citizens to even more bombardment and displacement, a time that we, the international community, must rise to the occasion and deliver on the promise of peace. With this in mind, and against the backdrop of widening humanitarian needs on the ground, Guyana calls upon the parties to engage in good faith in the ceasefire negotiations, uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, and put the interests of their populations first. We also continue to underscore that lasting and sustainable peace cannot be achieved at the expense of international law. The parties, therefore, must commit themselves to achieving a lasting peace based on international law and with full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Madam President, it has been said many times in this chamber that peace achieved through the use of force is not sustainable. Guyana supports those who work for peace, applying the tools of dialogue and diplomacy to bring about a peaceful and lasting settlement to this war. We call on all member states to support those efforts, including by implementing the relevant resolutions of the UN General Assembly and the Security Council. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Masuya for her briefing. The death and destruction caused by this war are tremendous. We heard from Assistant Secretary General Masuya about numbers: 12,000 civilians killed, 30,000 civilians injured. The total estimate cost of reconstruction is assessed at almost 500 billion euros. The vast majority of attacks that caused this represent a direct violation of international humanitarian law, and they need to stop immediately. After 3 long years of Russia's war of aggression, the fighting does not seem to be diminishing. Each week, hundreds of glide bombs and drones are deployed over Ukrainian cities. This year alone, Ukraine has been a target of more than 4,000 air and drone strikes. Just this February, civilian casualties increased by 35% compared to February last year. Humanitarian workers continue facing serious difficulties in assessing people in need due to ongoing protection risks and movement restrictions. Meanwhile, Russia's missiles keep hitting civilian targets. 2 weeks ago, for instance, a cluster munitions missile hit a civilian cargo ship in Odessa while it was loading wheat for Algeria. What's more, just a few days ago, a Russian missile attack hit a densely populated district in the border town of Sumy, damaging a children's hospital and 2 schools, and causing dozens of casualties, many of them children. Simultaneously, Russia was attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Slovenia is gravely concerned with the drone strike on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant protective shield, bringing us once more inches away from a nuclear accident. Such an event would have catastrophic consequences for Ukraine and the wider region. This Council should make every effort to prevent it from happening. Madam President, these attacks must stop. The killing needs to stop. Ukraine needs peace, and the whole of Europe needs peace. We have only one ask in relation to this, that the peace be in line with the UN Charter. Slovenia welcomes efforts of the United States to launch peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, and the proposal for a ceasefire and moratorium on attacks in the Black Sea. We remain hopeful this is the first step towards a verifiable and lasting cessation of hostilities that will lead to enduring peace in Ukraine. We obviously still have some lengths to go, and we hope that also in this chamber we will soon hear the language of peace and diplomacy. There has never been any other option for Slovenia but to advocate for peace, a path to peace. We will continue working in this Council and elsewhere towards a comprehensive, just and lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia. Slovenia wants peace and a sense of security to return to Europe. Thank you.
Representative of Slovenia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me at the outset to thank Ms. Joy Masuya on her for her valuable briefing. Madam President, more than 3 years ago, the repercussions, or for more than 3 years, the repercussions of the Ukraine-Russian war continue to affect both parties, the region, and the international community as a whole. Unfortunately, we continue to witness huge losses in innocent, unarmed civilians and an ongoing deterioration of the humanitarian situation. Civilian infrastructure has been destroyed. leaving no choice to civilians but to migrate in search of a safe place for their families or seek refuge in other countries to ask them for help and security. This conflict did not only impact the peoples of the region, its repercussions were felt around the world, especially in developing countries, which are now facing unprecedented energy and food crises. Despite the situation, which continues to cause grave concern, we note with satisfaction the new dynamics in recent days, seeking to launch a political dialogue to end the war. We continue to firmly believe that continuing to escalate is futile and does not bring peace to any party. Polarization will only fuel tension and steer us away from sustainable peace in the region. For this reason, we would like to stress the following points. 1. The ongoing losses in innocent civilians require us to reaffirm the urgent need for a ceasefire. For this reason, we call upon the parties to focus on the protection and safety of civilians as a priority and continue to make every effort to achieve a permanent ceasefire as soon as possible. In this vein, we welcome the encouraging partial agreements on a ceasefire, albeit circumstantial and limited. We urge parties to continue working on this track to put a final and comprehensive end to the hostilities. 2. We encourage parties to seize the current opportunity and engage in a serious and constructive dialogue to find a just, durable and peaceful solution to the conflict, a solution that is based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and that takes into account the legitimate security concerns of both parties. 3. We call upon the international community to intensify diplomatic efforts to support the current dialogue and contribute to a de-escalation and a convergence of views in order to end this crisis. In this vein, we renew our commitment to work bilaterally and internationally to support any effort that would put an end to the suffering of the people of the region and end the war peacefully and sustainably. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank the representative of Algeria for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Assistant Secretary General Joyce Musuya for an important briefing. The Security Council is convened today over 3 years since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, at a moment when cautious hope has begun to emerge on the horizon. Sierra Leone has consistently maintained that continued dialogue and good faith negotiations are the only viable path to a sustainable peace in Ukraine and the Russian Federation. We continue to urge the parties to remain committed to diplomacy and refrain from any actions that could jeopardize the current momentum towards peace. In this regard, we welcome the recent commencement of peace negotiations in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The development marks an important step forward after many months of deadlock. Sierra Leone acknowledges the efforts of the United States for facilitating the negotiations. We hope that these talks will lay the groundwork for a broader peace process and ultimately lead to direct negotiations between the principal parties to the conflict. It is imperative that all sides engage in these talks sincerely and constructively with a genuine commitment to achieving a just and lasting resolution. We also note with appreciation the announcement of a Black Sea ceasefire agreement resulting from the recent diplomatic engagement. This agreement reportedly aimed at halting hostilities in and around the Black Sea to ensure safe navigation. It's a welcome development that can reduce violence and improve maritime security, including the continued flow of essential goods. While we acknowledge this progress, further clarity on the agreement terms and robust confidence-building measures are needed. Such steps will help guarantee that all parties uphold their commitment and will foster the trust necessary to make the ceasefire durable. We hope this confidence gain can pave the way for broader de-escalation beyond the Black Sea region. Madam President, notwithstanding these diplomatic developments, Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned by the continued attacks, including on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, in particular missile and drone strikes targeting power plants, electricity grids, and other critical facilities across Ukraine. These assaults have devastated Ukraine's energy capability, with reports indicating that over 60% of the country's power generating infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed, leaving millions of civilians in darkness and cold. The resulting widespread outages cut off heating, water supply, telecommunications, and healthcare for countless families. Deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international humanitarian law, and we call for a halt of these strikes and full compliance with obligations to protect civilian life. The humanitarian situation in Ukraine is growing more dire with each passing day of the conflict. The toll on the civilian population is staggering. As briefed and according to United Nations report, more than 12,000 civilians have been killed and nearly 13,000 injured since the war began in February 2022. In addition to this horrific loss of life, nearly one-third of Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes, with over 6 million people have fled as refugees to neighboring countries, and millions more are internally displaced within Ukraine. Many civilians now endure severe hardships, especially after a bitter winter that has only compounded their suffering. In communities devastated by fighting and power shortages, families lack consistent access to electricity, heat, clean water, and medical care. Vulnerable groups, children and the elderly, and persons with disabilities are particularly at risk in these conditions, facing the harshest impact of the cold and disruption of essential services. The impact of the conflict on children has been particularly troubling. Trauma affecting children who are subjected to constant shelling and bombing is compounded by grief from the loss of loved ones, separation from family, friends, and family routines, and prolonged displacement and abduction from their homes. Tragically, data from OCHA indicates that at least 669 children were killed and 1,833 injured in Ukraine from 24 February 2022 through 31st December 2024, as well as 27 children killed and 137 injured in the Russian Federation over the same period. Just 3 months into 2025, casualty rate for children has significantly risen, with reports that more children have been killed and injured over the past 5 days in Ukraine than during the entire month of January. OCHA has concluded that, and I quote, "Children have been particularly affected by violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including summary executions, arbitrary detention, conflict-related sexual violence, torture, and ill treatment." End of quote. The magnitude of this crisis demands a coordinated and urgent humanitarian response. Sierra Leone calls on the international community, donors, and humanitarian organizations to work closely together to alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainian people. We welcome the continued efforts of United Nations agencies and other humanitarian organizations on the ground. We emphasize the need to fully fund and implement the UN Humanitarian Response Plan for Ukraine. This plan aims to assist roughly 14 million people with food, shelter, and medical services and other essential aid, yet it still faces significant funding gaps. We echo the urgent appeal of OCHA for increased support to close these gaps so that life-saving assistance can reach all those in need. Madam President, looking towards the prospect of peace and recovery, Sierra Leone underscores that the process must be inclusive and people-centered. All relevant stakeholders should have a voice in shaping Ukraine's future, including the relevant regional actors. In particular, we stress the importance of meaningful participation of women and youth in all peace efforts and post-conflict recovery initiatives. In closing, Sierra Leone reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, in particular, the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The Security Council has a vital role to play in upholding these principles, in protecting civilians, and in promoting a peaceful resolution of this conflict. In supporting ceasefires and peace agreements, this Council should ensure that they are guided by the principles of the UN Charter, as well as decisions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. As we urge the parties to put the needs of their citizens first and seek practical compromises that balance the immediate and long-term national interests and priorities, Sierra Leone will continue to support efforts aimed at alleviating human suffering and achieving a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Msuya for her briefing. Madam President, the war following Russia's invasion of Ukraine is now in its fourth year. Russia has not heeded repeated calls by the international community, consolidated in multiple General Assembly resolutions, to end its military operations, respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and withdraw its forces from its internationally recognized borders. As a direct consequence, the Ukrainian people continue to suffer, while this war has far-reaching repercussions affecting regional and global security. The window for a peaceful settlement has been opened in recent weeks, but more needs to be done to achieve a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine has confirmed 690 civilian casualties in February alone, while Russian aggression has caused hundreds of casualties during March, with persistent attacks against residential areas, parks, hotels, and children's medical facilities. Massive attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure in several regions have also taken place by using ballistic missiles, Shahed UAVs, and other combat drones, while attacks against commercial vessels in the Black Sea exacerbate food insecurity. Of particular note is the wide use of short-range drones, including first-person view drones, which account for the highest number of casualties, exceeding the impact of any other weapon. Casualties among children have now exceeded 2,550, with the number of child casualties in 2024 rising by more than 50% compared to the previous year. Surviving children bear scars for life, and many of them face mental health challenges due to the disruption of their everyday lives, the countless days spent in shelters, and the missed opportunities to socialize and learn. More than 1,700 education facilities and 800 medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed since the beginning of the war. Greece condemns in the strongest possible terms attacks against civilians and civilian objects and joins calls to immediately cease all attacks against residential areas and critical infrastructure in Ukraine. All parties must adhere to their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. We also deplore the violations of human rights in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and call on Russia to ensure unfettered humanitarian access to POWs and civilian detainees and cooperate fully with all international monitoring and investigative bodies. It is also of paramount importance that we ensure accountability and we support international efforts in this regard as a further guarantee for any peace arrangement. We firmly believe that violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes should be thoroughly investigated by the relevant international institutions and the perpetrators be brought to justice. Turning to the peace track, Greece takes note of the advancements achieved in recent weeks, the joint statement by Ukraine and the United States in Jeddah, and the fact that Ukraine is back at the negotiating table. We also express our satisfaction over the 30-day immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure agreed between the United States and Russia, although we regret that Russia has not accepted a full 30-day ceasefire. We also echo the Secretary General's comment that reaching an agreement on safe and free navigation in the Black Sea with security commitments and in line with the UN Charter and international law would be a crucial contribution to global food security and supply chains. Madam President, what is needed now is not only a cessation of hostilities, but also a just, comprehensive peace through inclusive diplomacy based on the United Nations Charter and international law in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. A ceasefire seems not to be enough. We need to establish a solid framework for peace, security, and prosperity. This peace should only be possible with credible and robust security guarantees which will deter and prevent the recurrence of war in the future. A sustainable peace can only be achieved through strength and resilience with the active engagement of the United States, Ukraine, and Europe, as the security of Ukraine is inextricably intertwined with global security and stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank ASG Masuya for her briefing, providing an overview of the humanitarian situation resulting from this conflict. We also take note of her call for cessation of hostilities and an end to this conflict. We also welcome the participation of Ukraine and other European members in this meeting. Madam President, Pakistan is deeply concerned by this conflict that has caused immense human suffering and massive damage to infrastructure, economy, and society. It has had vast consequences for the global economy and particularly for the developing countries. Pakistan's position on this and other conflicts is based on adherence to the principles of the UN Charter, self-determination for peoples, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and non-acquisition of territory by the threat or use of force. Consistent with the Charter, states must also implement international agreements and abide by their respective obligations, and also respond to the legitimate security interests of all states. Madam President, in the context of today's meeting, I would like to make the following points. First, the conflict in Ukraine, which has now entered its fourth year, has taken a heavy toll on the civilian population. This is highly regrettable. Every human life matters and is not merely a number. Second, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is an obligation under international law and international humanitarian law, and must be fully and consistently respected by all parties. Third, for a humanitarian response to be effective and responsive to the needs of the affected population, it is vital that access and protection of humanitarian workers be ensured. The parties are under obligation to ensure conditions that allow unimpeded access for the humanitarian workers while ensuring their protection. Fourth, the Third Geneva Convention related to treatment of prisoners of war is binding on all parties to the conflict. Strict adherence to those obligations must be ensured. And President, this Council is meeting to discuss developments related to Ukraine for the first time since the adoption of Resolution 2774 last month. That resolution mourned the tragic loss of life throughout this conflict, reiterated that the principal purpose of the UN, in accordance with its charter, was to maintain international peace and security and to peacefully settle disputes. It also called for a swift end to the conflict and a lasting peace. This resolution and the ensuing diplomatic efforts have imparted a new impetus to the prospects for an early end to the fighting. In this context, we welcome the limited ceasefire agreement reached, banning the targeting of energy-related infrastructure, and more recently, to ensure safe navigation in the Black Sea. We appreciate the US and its leadership's active engagement, also involving the Russian and Ukrainian leadership in bringing this to fruition. We remain optimistic that this new dynamic and the momentum generated by these initial steps would eventually lead to a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire. We hope that the parties would earnestly abide by their commitments. We also commend the role of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its leadership in facilitating dialogue for promoting peace. When President Pakistan's position on the Ukraine conflict has been consistent, Pakistan enjoys friendly relations with both Russia and Ukraine. From the outset, we have advocated dialogue and diplomacy, immediate cessation of hostilities, and a peaceful resolution of this conflict. We believe that security concerns, which remain at the center of this conflict, can only be addressed through an inclusive approach, which in turn would ensure the sustainability and durability of peace in the wider region. To conclude, I would like to reiterate Pakistan's support for diplomatic initiatives for cessation of hostilities and that help bridge differences and lead the parties towards a peaceful, just and durable settlement of this tragic conflict through a constructive and inclusive process in full respect of UN Charter, international law, the relevant multilateral agreements, and which at the same time is responsive to the legitimate national security interests of all sides. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to extend my gratitude to ASG Joyce Msuya for her briefing. We also welcome Ukraine and other European representatives in today's meeting. It has now been 1 month since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2774, which reflected the international community's strong desire for a swift end to the war in Ukraine. Yet the attacks and hostilities continue. As ASG Msuya just briefed, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine has not improved at all. We are deeply concerned about the ongoing enormous suffering and the casualties of the Ukrainian civilian population. While the Republic of Korea continues to provide humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, we strongly urge an immediate end to attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, and high-rises, in accordance with international humanitarian law. This also directly undermines concurrent diplomatic efforts supported by this Council for an early resolution to the conflict. Madam President, we note with appreciation the ongoing ceasefire negotiations, including the recent round in Riyadh, to advance efforts toward an energy facilities ceasefire and safe and free navigation in the Black Sea. The Republic of Korea is of the view that this is a highly significant step. We echo the Secretary General's assessment that such progress can lead to important confidence-building measures toward the de-escalation of the war. In addition, the exchange of 175 prisoners of war by each side last week is a welcome development. However, we have witnessed continued attacks on innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure even during negotiations this week. We emphasize once again that international humanitarian law should be observed under any circumstances. Madam President, this senseless war must come to an end without further delay. The Republic of Korea sincerely hopes that the ongoing diplomatic efforts will pave the way for a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace, one that fully respects the principles and spirit of the UN Charter. In addition to the war's conclusion and the restoration of peace in Ukraine, we also take deep interest in the process and conditions of ending the war, as they will have far-reaching implications, not only for the future of European security, but also for the global security landscape. Madam President, this war has inflicted serious suffering not only on the Ukrainian people and Russian soldiers and their families, but also on those of North Korea. Indeed, interviews with captured North Korean soldiers in Crux have revealed how these young men were deceived by their leadership and being told they were sent to Russia for training, not to fight in a war. Reportedly, their families remain unaware that their sons have been sent abroad to engage in another country's deadly conflict until the authorities issue a certificate of death in battle. Pyongyang even compelled the bereaved families to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding the loss of lives. As rightly stressed in the report of Special Rapporteur Elizabeth Salmon on the situation of human rights in the DPRK last month, the conditions in which North Korean soldiers perform military service can constitute serious human rights violations. Pyongyang must stop sacrificing its own people to sustain the regime in exchange for military, political, and economic support from Moscow. According to North Korea's state media, when Kim Jong-un met Russia's top security officer Shoigu in Pyongyang last Friday, he emphasized his unwavering support for Russia's so-called special military operations. The two countries also reaffirmed their intention to fully implement the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership signed last year. This implies that this illegal military cooperation will continue in violation of the Security Council resolutions. This also undoubtedly flies in the face of international efforts for an end to the war in Ukraine. We urge Russia and North Korea to immediately halt their illegal military cooperation. In conclusion, Madam President, the Republic of Korea will continue to cooperate with the international community for the restoration of peace and the post-war construction in Ukraine. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank SG Masuya for her briefing. The Ukraine crisis has been dragging on with constant new civilian casualties. It is heartbreaking. One more day of the war means one more day of harm and destruction, and one more day of tumult and instability. Under no circumstances should civilians be the target of attacks. Their safety should be protected. At present, political resolution of the Ukraine crisis is approaching a critical moment, and a window of peace is opening. China welcomes all efforts that will lead to ceasefire, a necessary step towards peace. China welcomes the agreement reached between the U.S. and Russia on having dialogue and peace talks, and welcomes the recent negotiations between Russia and the U.S. and between Ukraine and the U.S. in Riyadh, where positive progress was made on navigational safety in Black Sea, ceasefire on energy infrastructure, and Russian agricultural and fertilizer exports, among others. China supports the conclusion of a just, lasting, and binding peace agreement that is accepted by all parties with the participation of all parties and stakeholders. As the fighting is on the European soil, Europe ought to play its part for peace, to jointly address the root causes of the crisis, and to find a balanced, effective, and sustainable security framework so as to achieve long-term security and stability on the European continent. Last September, China partnered with Brazil and other countries in the Global South to launch the Group of Friends for Peace. The group has been consistently guided by the purposes and principles of UN Charter in its work to rally positive forces in support of a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Last Thursday, the group met again at the ambassadorial level and spoke to the press, reiterating the call for an immediate and complete ceasefire and urging all parties and stakeholders to embrace the opportunity and engage constructively in peace talks. The group believes that the shared goal must be to find a just and lasting solution that addresses concerns of all parties to the conflict and to reach a peace agreement acceptable to them. The UN can play a role in fostering such diplomatic efforts and in the implementation of any peace agreement. The group members are worried about risks and crises arising from this, which has caused repercussions across many countries, including those in the Global South. The group is of the view that issues such as food and energy security, as well as humanitarian assistance, should be integral to the peace process. The voices of the Global South in support of the peace in the region should be heard and heeded. As the situation continues to evolve rapidly, members of the group are committed to maintaining close engagement with one another and with all relevant parties. The group members will strive to deepen the understanding of the diverse perspectives, foster common ground, and play a constructive role in supporting all efforts toward peace. Together, the group members stand ready to contribute to a peaceful resolution of the conflict and a better future for all. President, China has always maintained an objective and impartial position on the Ukraine question, guided by the principle of the four shoulds proposed by President Xi Jinping. We have actively engage with all relevant parties to work for peace and push for talks. We will continue to work with the international community to raise the voice of reason for peace talks, build conditions and momentum for ceasefire and peace talks, and play a positive and constructive role in achieving a political solution to the Ukraine crisis. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me start by thanking ASG Monsieur for the briefing today. Colleagues, last month marked 3 years since President Putin launched his illegal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The invasion displaced over 10 million people. Today, 12.7 million remain in need of urgent humanitarian support. The suffering caused by Russian forces is well known to this Council. War crimes, torture of civilians and prisoners of war, mass killings, the forced deportation of thousands of children, the forced cleansing and Russification of areas under their illegal control. It is a shocking record for any state, let alone a permanent member of the Security Council. In recent weeks, Russian drone and missile attacks have intensified nationwide, with daily reports of damage to residential areas and civilian infrastructure across multiple oblasts. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mechanism of Ukraine, in one attack, which took place on 7 March, 2 ballistic missiles hit a residential area in Donetsk Oblast, killing 11 people and destroying homes. Emergency responders who arrived to treat the wounded were then targeted by further strikes. This has to stop. The UK is clear that we want to see an end to the fighting and to the killing. We must have enduring peace in Ukraine. Putin could bring about peace tomorrow by withdrawing his forces and ending his illegal invasion. President, we welcome US efforts towards a just and lasting peace. And we welcome President Zelensky's clear commitment to peace and readiness to move quickly towards a comprehensive and lasting settlement. In agreeing to a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire, Ukraine has shown that it is the party of peace. Russia must now agree to this without further delay. Ukraine's humanitarian needs are immense, and the UK will continue to do what we can in support. To date, we have committed £477 million in humanitarian support to Ukraine, providing its people with food, water, shelter and medical care, alongside support to safeguard the rights, dignity and well-being of civilians. We repeat our call on Russia to end its brutal war, withdraw from Ukrainian territory within its internationally recognized borders. Until that day comes, the UK will continue to work with Ukraine and our international partners to achieve a just and lasting peace, which ensures Ukraine's future security and upholds the core principles of the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I give the floor now to the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Msuya, for your briefing, which powerfully reinforces that this war must end now. Just over 1 month ago, on the 3rd anniversary of the escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war, this Council adopted Resolution 2774, imploring a swift end to the war. As we noted in that landmark resolution, the first in this Council since the war began, and as we have sadly heard again today, there has been a tragic loss of life throughout this conflict. In the weeks since the adoption of that resolution, continued fighting has injured or killed more soldiers and civilians on both sides. The war continues to have a devastating impact, particularly on children. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine reported last week that children living in occupied territories have suffered summary executions, arbitrary detention, and torture. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified 669 children were killed and 1,833 injured in Ukraine between February of 2022 and the end of 2024. Russian forces have destroyed homes, schools, and medical facilities and forcibly transferred thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia, as President Trump discussed with President Zelensky last week. The war must end. We must all continue to agree on this. The United States commends Ukraine and the Russian Federation for taking the first steps towards a ceasefire, including participating in technical level talks this week. We welcome the proposed partial ceasefires on strikes against energy infrastructure and in the Black Sea, agreed to in principle by the leaders of both sides. If fully implemented, these agreements will be an important first step on the path to peace. They will protect lives and improve livelihoods, but the first step alone is not enough. We call on both sides to abide by these agreements and expand on them to reach a comprehensive ceasefire. The United States is committed to achieving a lasting peace, not just a temporary pause, and is pursuing that goal through direct dialogue with both Ukraine and Russia. Last week, President Trump spoke with the presidents of both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. On March 18th, President Putin agreed the conflict needs to end with a lasting peace. And on March 19th, President Zelensky agreed that the lasting peace can be achieved. For the first time since February 2022, perhaps the first time since February 2014, we are seeing the common ground between Russia and Ukraine expanding rather than shrinking. That in itself is grounds for optimism. We call on all Security Council members and all UN member states to lend their support to our efforts to achieve a swift, durable peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I give the floor now to the Russian Federation. Representative of the Russian Federation, sorry.
Thank you, Madam President. Before I begin my intervention, I'd like to express our principled opposition with the way the presidency has proceeded inviting delegations under Rule 37. In violation of established practice, the Danish presidency has single-handedly taken a decision to give an opportunity to speak to 4 EU and NATO member states, as well as to the representative of the EU itself. We've stated on numerous occasions that inviting so many participants, especially those who practice block discipline, add no value to our discussions. Your actions, despite the working methods you yourself distributed to us, will result in a protracted discussion, turning the discussion into a debate, which we Council members did not agree to. We see this not only a dirty trick on the part of the presidency, but also an attempt to exert pressure on Council members. There can be no other rationale for turning a Security Council meeting into a NATO meeting is possible. It's a shame that Copenhagen, as the presidency draws to a close, is showing open contempt for the practices and procedures of the Security Council, placing NATO interests and its national position above its Security Council presidency duties. The Security Council presidency is supposed to ensure impartial discussions and to ensure the rules of procedure are adhered to. Madam President, we all saw how the European sponsors of the Kiev regime dithered on whether to request yet another meeting on Ukraine this month. On the one hand, they did want to engage in this box-ticking exercise in the month of March. On the other hand, they didn't want to show their hand, not to create the impression that the EU and the UK are trying to thwart US and Russian efforts to settle the Ukrainian crisis. As a result, practically at the last moment, when the month of March was almost over, London and Brussels finally did decide to take this step, using as a pretext the letters regularly sent by the Ukrainian mission to the Security Council, with baseless assertions about Russian strikes, supposedly strikes on civilian objects in Ukraine. As we've stated on numerous occasions, Russian airspace forces only strike those objects which are linked to the military capabilities of the Kiev regime. That's why civilians in Ukraine generally either become casualties due to pieces of downed rockets and drones because the Ukrainian air defenses, in violation of IHL norms, set up these defenses in residential areas of Ukrainian cities, or because anti-aircraft missiles fall on them. The Ukrainians then try to portray these as consequences of Russian strikes, and it's not very convincing. After all, Ukrainians themselves, despite a strict ban imposed by the Zelensky regime's punitive authorities, the Ukrainians themselves are reporting and posting information about impacts online, thereby refuting the propagandistic concoctions of their own authorities. It is thanks to such posts that the attempt to portray the blowing up of a school in Sumy on the 24th of March as a deliberate strike by the Russian airspace forces on civilian infrastructure, that this attempt was thwarted. The pictures widely shared on social media show how, following the outbreak of a fire at the center of a residential area, it looks like the result of a falling down drone, that suddenly there's a large-scale detonation of stored ammunition in a neighboring building. The involvement of the Kiev regime in this incident, with the regime storing ammunition in residential areas, was so blatantly obvious that its social media post about a supposed Russian strike had to be corrected even by the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Mr. Andrei Yermak. As for the Ukrainian mission to the United Nations, which cited this episode in its 24th March letter, calling it a Russian missile strike, didn't manage to fix it in time. It thus threw its European sponsors under the bus, as they, the Europeans, today also referred to this incident. Here is a telling example of an attempt to manipulate the Security Council to provide members with false information. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of such examples. And yet, Ukraine's European champions are not noticing point blank the crimes of the Kiev regime committed against civilians in Russia. Recently, we were briefed by the European Commissioner, Ms. Kallas, and she shamelessly asserted that there are no such casualties. We'll leave that on her conscience, although it would appear that she doesn't have one. What I'd like to do is cite some statistics covering just the latest few weeks. In just 1 week, between the 17th and the 23rd of March, over 150 civilians suffered in the Donetsk People's Republics, in the Belgorod, Kursk, Kherson, and the Lugansk National Republic as well. 16 people died, 134 were injured, including 4 minors. Just 2 days ago, on the 24th of March, in the Lugansk People's Republic of the Russian Federation, due to the deliberate shelling of a civilian vehicle by the Ukrainian armed forces, 3 Russian media workers perished. A war correspondent working for Izvestia, Mr. Alexander Fedorchuk, TV channel Zvezda operator, Mr. Andrei Panov, and a film crew driver, Mr. Alexander Sekeli. 2 correspondents were badly injured as well. Today we learned that in an area where Ukrainian sabotage groups are operating in the Belgorod area, Channel 1 correspondent Ms. Anna Prokofieva died, and the operator Dmitry Volkov was seriously injured. Where are the condemnations of these crimes on the part of Western societies, on part of the UN? Or do you think that the killings of journalists, if they're Russian, do you think that doesn't merit a response? Although we've gotten used to the fact that the deaths of Russian people in Europe, which is beholden to caveman-style Russophobia, will not be condemned. It's not seen as a crime. We all remember that since 2014, when there was an anti-constitutional coup d'etat in Kiev, and neo-Nazis and nationalists came to power, since then, Europe and the West have looked on silently as Russians were burnt alive in Odessa in the Trade Union House, and throughout the 8 years when the Kiev regime waged war against Russian-speaking civilians in the Donbass. So your unprincipled and selective deafness, ladies and gentlemen, comes as no surprise. That's why we took the situation in hand and over 3 years ago began the special military operation to end the war being waged on fellow Russians by the Kiev regime. Madam President, today, after the new Republican administration entered the White House, led by President Donald Trump, we do have hope of the Ukrainian crisis being at last resolved, seeing lasting and long-term peace reign in Ukraine. All that was necessary was a sensible assessment of the situation and political will. The embodiment of this change, of course, was the adoption by the Security Council on the 24th of February of Resolution 2774, with much gnashing of teeth on the part of our European colleagues. Of course, this is just the beginning. For now, the US and Russia are just looking for the understandings which the entire world is interested in. Our leaders, ministers, and expert teams have resumed talks and have already achieved noteworthy results. Yesterday, following technical level talks in Al Riyadh, Russia and the US agreed to begin implementing the Black Sea Initiative. The initiative speaks to safety of navigation in the Black Sea, non-use of force, and avoiding the use of commercial vessels for military purposes. As we all recall, it is precisely owing to such actions committed by the Kiev regime that the previous similar attempt fell through. To avoid new incidents of this kind, we do intend to have proper controls imposed, i.e. the inspection of such vessels. Moreover, the US agreed to facilitate the resumption of access of Russian agricultural and fertilizer exports to world markets, lowering the cost of ensuring such maritime trade and broadening access to ports and payment systems for such transactions. It's important to understand that, as per the agreement, the initiative will be resumed only after a series of measures are adopted. These are aimed at lifting sanctions on the Russian State Agricultural Bank, Rossельхозbank, and other Russian financial organizations involved in international food and fertilizer trading, including connecting these banks to the SWIFT system. The lifting of a number of other restrictions on Russia is also envisaged. Moreover, Russia and the US agreed to craft measures to implement the agreements entered into by the presidents of both countries on bans on strikes on energy facilities in Russia and Ukraine for 30 days, starting on the 18th of March of this year, with the possibility of extension and also the possibility of withdrawal from the deal in the event of non-compliance therewith by one of the parties. As you know, Russia has been upholding this understanding for over a week now. The same cannot be said about the Zelensky regime. In word, they did seem to agree to the deal. And yet, barely 3 hours after they announced this, the Kiev regime launched 3 drones at energy infrastructure in Staritsa-Kavkazskaya on the Kuban River. There was crude being pumped into the Caspian Pipeline Consortium system. In the early hours of the 21st of March, there was an explosion at the Suja gas metering station in the Kursk region, through which gas was being pumped to Europe. And this was actually under Ukrainian armed forces control at the time. On the 23rd of March, the UAF conducted a mass artillery strike on an electrical substation in the Zaporizhia region, leaving 11,000 people without electricity. On 24th March, the Kiev regime struck with a drone at a crude pumping station at the Kropotkinskaya station, also belonging to the Caspian Consortium. On the same day, the Kuban branch of the Rosseti Power Company was hit. As a result, power supply was cut off to the Rostovskaya and PP Tihoretskaya. In Lugansk, there was an attack on a gas distribution station in Svatova, and in the Crimea, a drone was down, the aim of which was an underground gas storage facility, Glebskaya facility. By the way, the Kiev regime tried to attack that same facility again just this morning. Also, the UAF attacked using drones energy facilities in Bryansk and Kursk regions. In other words, the Kiev, in word, agreed to this energy ceasefire, yet it continues to plan and conduct strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, thus trying to hoodwink both us and the United States. It's plain that in so doing, it's trying to foil any peace agreements, clearly demonstrating the fact that we can't do business with Kiev. The Russian Federation reserves the right to respond should the Kiev regime continue on this destructive course. Madam President, foiling this settlement process launched by Russia and the US, pulling its European allies into a confrontation with the Russian Federation, it's the last hope of the ringleader in Kiev. He, together with his completely and utterly corrupt posse, are trying to cling on to power. As you know, in March, Zelensky's Kursk venture ignominiously ended. To date, 90% of the territory of the Kursk region has been liberated. In August last year, Ukrainian Nazis invaded it. The cost, as many warned, was catastrophic for Ukraine. Over 70,000 people died. and hundreds, if not thousands, of units of military equipment provided by the West was lost. As a result, the combat capability of the UAF was undermined. Ukraine is losing more and more territory in the east, and because reserves have been sent to Kursk, the front line in the east has basically collapsed. Despite the utterly barbaric and anti-constitutional methods used by Ukraine, the forced mobilization has stalled. Ukrainian men snatched in the streets and forcibly sent to the front have refused to fight and surrender as soon as they can. The Kiev princeling has now seen the prospect of elections and payback for all of the crimes he's committed against his country and his people. Also, he's going to have to answer to the West for the billions he stole, billions that were allocated to help the Ukraine. And this is Zelensky's worst nightmare. To avoid it, he will do anything. He isn't afraid of more Ukrainian casualties, nor is he afraid of provoking a conflict between nuclear powers. That is why he's desperately maneuvering, lying, deceiving, contradicting himself, clutching at straws to extend the agony of his regime, having turned Ukraine into a concentration camp and into a private military company fighting for illusory Western geopolitical interests. But his efforts will come to nothing. A long-term solution will be found to the Ukrainian crisis. Today, thanks to the efforts of the presidents of Russia and the US, there's a real chance of the solution to the crisis being diplomatic. For dozens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of ordinary Ukrainian lives to be saved. There is, of course, also a military scenario, and we are prepared to implement that if need be. Yet we prefer peace and diplomacy, as we've consistently stated in every single statement we've delivered in this chamber. What do you prefer? To continue pumping private military company Ukraine full of weapons, trying to thwart a settlement of the conflict, or will you join the ranks of Russia and the US and find a long-term solution that would address the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis and strengthen security in Europe and the world over? The choice is yours. Remember this when the warmongering forces on a rampage in some European countries are going to try and thwart efforts being undertaken by Moscow and Washington when they suggest to the past Ukrainian president to engage in more ventures which have the potential to turn out deadly for the state of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. And before I give the floor to the next speaker, allow me just to respond to the concerns raised by the Russian Federation about the list of speakers. During the past months, different council presidencies have had the practice of inviting between 4 and 8 Rule 39 and 37 speakers to the briefings on Ukraine. For instance, we had 8 in February, we had 4 in January, and we had 6 in December. So we believe that 7 speakers under Rule 37 and 39, which we invited today, is well within the normal practice of the Council. All of those speakers have on previous occasions requested and have been granted to speak before the Council on this topic. Moreover, it's very much in line with our working methods, as listed in this paper, about an inclusive Security Council. And we have not received any comments to the list of speakers before today's meeting. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the Russian representative of the Russian Federation has asked for a comment.
As you responded to what I said, I will take the opportunity to respond to you. Madam President, referring to bad examples is a terrible practice. It only serves to further undermine your efforts in the seat of the presidency. What's more is, one of the events you referred to, the February event, the event in February, was a ministerial meeting. You know that full well. After all, we're all adults here in the room. Let's not look for childlike justifications for our mistakes. Let's simply recognize the mistakes we make.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. The presidency does not have anything to add to this discussion. As mentioned already, the practice of this meeting is well within the already established practice of the Council. I'll now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by thanking ASG Msuya for her comprehensive and sobering briefings to the Council today. I also want to welcome Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, head of the delegation of the European Union, to participate in our discussions today. Madam President, recent breakthrough in Riyadh Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with the United States has successfully facilitated agreement between the parties and built upon the Resolution 2774, creating a tangible momentum toward de-escalation. The agreement to ensure safe navigation in the Black Sea, particularly for commercial vessels, represents a practical step toward reducing tensions and protecting vital economic infrastructure. However, we must acknowledge the continuing humanitarian challenges. As ASG Musoya briefings make clear, the humanitarian situation remains dire, particularly in the frontline areas where civilian infrastructures and essential services have been severely impacted. The protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure remains paramount, particularly in the frontline regions where access to basic services have been severely impacted. Madam President, in light of this development and continuing challenges, this Council should focus on three priorities. First, supporting the implementation and the monitoring of the recently agreed maritime safety measure and infrastructure protection arrangement. Second, expanding humanitarian access to affected populations, particularly in areas where delivery of essential services has been compromised. Third, building this momentum to encourage broader dialogue toward a comprehensive ceasefire and sustainable political solutions. While challenges remain, these steps toward de-escalation provide foundation for further diplomatic initiatives. As we move forward, this Council must remain actively engaged in supporting this positive development while addressing an ongoing humanitarian needs. Madam President, to conclude, there is no military solution to the conflict in Ukraine. The only sustainable solution is to work together toward strengthening diplomatic engagement and create a condition conducive to a just and lasting peace. The path to peace begins with ceasefire, continues through respect for international law and international humanitarian law, and ends with justice. We remain committed to these principles and for our most determined efforts to restore peace in Ukraine and its people and the region in whole. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. Assistant Secretary General Masuya, thank you for your sobering briefing. Your briefing confirmed once again that since we last discussed the aggression against Ukraine in the Security Council, we've seen continued airstrikes by the Russian Federation, which have killed civilians and damaged civilian infrastructure. In the last month, we've seen multiple attacks on hospitals, apartment blocks, administrative buildings, supermarkets, and commercial vessels. Attacks continue unabated. As ASG Masuya has mentioned, a particularly deadly attack was launched on March 7 against a city center in Donetsk Oblast. The attack resulted in 11 civilian deaths and over 50 injured, including 7 children. A double-tap strike then deliberately targeted the rescue service attempting to free survivors trapped under the rubble. It was the same on March 12. A hotel targeted in central Ukraine with 16 civilian casualties and a double-tap against survivors and those desperately trying to help them. These are cowardly and despicable actions. Tragically, these attacks against Ukrainian civilians continue without pause. On March 21st, a child and both her parents were killed in Zaporizhzhia, with 14 other civilians injured. On March 23rd, a 5-year-old girl and her father were killed in Kyiv, with 10 more civilians injured. And on March 24th, missiles struck apartment blocks and schools in Sumy, injuring at least 88, including 17 children. And just this month, over a 7-day period, Russia launched 2,700 missiles, drones and glide bombs at Ukraine. Needless to say, the humanitarian suffering caused by such a ceaseless aerial blitz is truly horrific. Colleagues, Russia's illegal war of aggression is not just a European concern. On March 11, a Russian ballistic missile, armed with cluster munitions, targeted a Barbados-flagged civilian vessel in Odessa, loading wheat bound for Algeria. The attack killed 4 Syrian sailors and wounded 2 other civilians. Another display of the complete disregard for civilian lives. This contributes to humanitarian suffering across the globe, as the most vulnerable, especially in several African countries, face much higher food and energy prices and scarcity in supplies. In recent days, we've received the latest report by the UN's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. It is a grim catalogue of crimes against humanity perpetrated by Russian forces against civilians and war crimes against prisoners of war, including systematic torture and even executions. The report notes an apparent new policy in Russia's armed forces to not take prisoners, but to kill them. Colleagues, I want to highlight the extreme vulnerability of Ukraine's women. I paid tribute to the brave testimonies given here in New York 2 weeks ago by Ukrainian women held captive for years by Russian forces and subjected to terrible abuse and degradation. We also remember the Ukrainian children who have been adopted to Russia and had their identity brutally erased. This underlines that if there is to be an enduring peace, it must be built on accountability and justice for all. Russia's systemic violations of international humanitarian law in the temporarily occupied territories are well documented, including by the United Nations. We have frequently heard in this chamber how Russia has cut off around 1.5 million Ukrainians from humanitarian aid. We call on Russia to respect its international obligations and facilitate full, safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to the territories it has temporarily occupied. We call on the international community to heed the call we heard this morning from ASG Masuya for more support. Denmark has, since the beginning of this brutal war, allocated $1 billion in humanitarian and civilian aid. Colleagues, Russia could end the war today if it would only stop attacking Ukraine. Russia has raised preconditions for peace, while at the same time increasing attacks on Ukrainian civilians, resulting in further humanitarian suffering. We have noted the first steps towards a ceasefire. It remains crucial that further steps are taken towards a just and lasting peace, respecting Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and territorial integrity. The majority of the United Nations members clearly stood with the people of Ukraine on the 3rd anniversary of Russia's illegal, full-scale invasion. They reaffirmed their commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. They demanded that any peace must be in line with the principles of the UN Charter, the charter we all signed up for. Denmark will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine as we, hopefully, move closer towards a just, comprehensive, and enduring peace. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Denmark's presidency for convening this meeting. I'm also grateful to ASG Joy Msuya for her substantive briefing. Russian Federation continues to terrorize Ukrainian civilians by relentlessly striking critical infrastructure and residential areas across the country with missiles, MLRS, guided bombs, and attack drones, causing widespread death and destruction. Frontline and border regions, particularly Sumy, Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih, and Kharkiv, remain under constant Russian attack. Distinguished members of the Security Council, we should focus on Russian actions and not their statements, and the actions are the following. On night of 1st March, the Russian Federation launched at least 9 Shahed drones on Kharkiv, damaging a hospital with patients inside and injuring at least 7. On night of 3rd March, Russian attack on an eco park near Kharkiv destroyed animal enclosures, a medical center, and a mother and a child house. The same day, airstrikes on Omelnik, Zaporizhia, destroyed a home, killing 1 and injuring another. On 4 March, a drone strike on Sumy caused a fire in a children's medical facility. On 5 March, a ballistic missile struck a hotel in Kryvyi Rih, killing at least 4 and injuring 32, including 2 children. Damage included 14 apartment buildings, a post office, cultural center, shops, and vehicles. On 7 March, a massive Russian assault on energy infrastructure hit multiple regions across Ukraine, Odessa, Poltava, Chernihiv, Ternopil, using nearly 70 missiles and 200 drones. In Kharkiv, a missile injured civilians near an apartment building. That same day at night, the Russian Federation launched a ballistic missile attack on the center of Dobropilla, Donetsk region, killing at least 11 people and injuring 50 others, including 7 children. As firefighters worked to extinguish the blaze, Russian forces carried out a second strike targeting the rescuers. On 11 March, Russian drones damaged an infrastructure facility in Dnipro, about 10 private houses, and broke windows in a kindergarten and a school. On 12 March, Russia launched ballistic missiles at Kryvyi Rih, killing 1 person and injuring 15. Russia launched a double-tap strike on rescuers and medics who arrived at the scene. The strike damaged an infrastructure facility, multi-story residential buildings, administrative buildings, a shop, garages, 12 cars, and 2 units of rescue equipment. On 13 March, Russians massively attacked Kherson with artillery, killing a woman and injuring a man. The same day, critical infrastructure facilities in Zaporizhia and Dnipro regions were attacked. On 14 March, Russians attacked a hospital in Zolochiv, Kharkiv region with drones. A double-tap attack was carried out in 40 minutes after the first strike. On 14 March, Russian troops attacked the center of Kherson with guided aerial bombs, killing 1 and injuring 7 civilians. On 15 March, an attack drone damaged 65 apartments in a multi-story building, 12 private houses, and 19 cars in one of Chernihiv's neighborhoods. On 16 March, an attack drone hit a multi-story building in Chernihiv, injuring a woman. On 21 March, the Russian Federation launched a drone attack on Zaporizhia, killing a family, a 17-year-old girl, father, and her mother. The attack injured at least 14 people, including a 9-month-old baby. The drone strikes caused fires and widespread destruction in Zaporizhia. Overnight, on 23 March, Russia attacked residential areas of Ukraine using nearly 150 strike drones. Russia's massive drone attack on Kyiv and the Kyiv region killed at least 3 people, including a father and his 5-year-old daughter, and injuring 10 others, including an 11-month-old baby. This attack damaged apartment buildings, private houses, and cars. On 24 March, the Russian Federation launched a missile strike on the city center of Sumy, injuring at least 88 people, including 17 children, and damaging several high-rise residential buildings and civilian infrastructure, including a school. The same day, Russia launched its third consecutive overnight air attack on Kyiv. 25 March, the Russian forces struck a residential area in the village of Kurtivka, Donetsk region, with a FAB-250 bomb, killing a 36-year-old mother and her 3-year-old daughter, and injuring her 15-year-old daughter, who was hospitalized. The family was at a playground when the strike hit them. Last night, Russia launched 117 strike drones, mostly Shaheds, against civilians across Ukraine. Dnipro, Sumy, Cherkasy, and other regions came under Russian attack. Kryvyi Rih suffered a massive drone strike targeting a local enterprise and the civilian infrastructure. In Ochtyrka, Sumy region, homes, stores, and the civilian infrastructure were damaged. Communities in Donetsk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia regions also came under fire. It was another night of Russian terror targeting Ukrainian civilians. These attacks are a daily reality. In just the first half of March alone, the Russian Federation launched hundreds of strikes against the Ukrainian people using approximately 2,800 guided aerial bombs, nearly 2,000 attack drones, and over 100 missiles of various types. Which means that on average, Russia used each day 200 guided aerial bombs, 143 attack drones, and 7 missiles every single day. Russian Federation must be held accountable for the vast destruction it has inflicted on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. According to Ukrainian law enforcement, over 212,000 civilian sites have been damaged or destroyed, including over 171,000 residential buildings. The attacks have also affected over 1,600 schools, with at least 200 completely destroyed, and nearly 2,000 medical facilities, of which 300 have been destroyed to rubble. Madam President, from the very first day of the invasion, Russia has deliberately sought to block Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea, directly threatening global food security. It has consistently targeted southern East Ukraine's port infrastructure, commercial vessels, and grain storage facilities. All this was done to weaken Ukraine's export capacity and deliberately provoke a food crisis in regions heavily reliant on Ukrainian grain. On 1st March, Russia launched a missile strike on port infrastructure in Odessa, injuring 2 port workers and damaging 2 civilian vessels, including a Sierra Leone flagged bulk carrier loaded with over 21,000 tons of corn and soybeans, and a Panama flagged container ship. On 11 March, a ballistic missile attack on the same port killed 4 Syrian crew members and injured 2 others, a Ukrainian and Syrian. The attack damaged another ship, docks and grain storage facilities. The vessel targeted was loading wheat for export to Algeria. Such strikes directly undermine food security in vulnerable regions across the globe. Today, over 40 countries rely on Ukrainian grain exports. These deliberate attacks risk deepening instability in areas already facing food shortages. Madam President, in its latest report, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has further confirmed that the widespread use of torture is not incidental, but a deliberate and systematic element of Russian state policy, amounting to crimes against humanity. The report documents ongoing torture of civilians and POWs, inhuman detention conditions, and the use of sexual violence, particularly against male detainees, as a method of torture. It also presents clear evidence of numerous executions of prisoners of war and disturbing take-no-prisoners policy by the Russian military, in direct and cynical violation of the Geneva Conventions. The Commission's efforts to investigate and document Russia's war crimes are essential to ensuring justice and accountability. We therefore urge continued support of its mandate and the allocation of adequate funding to sustain its work. Ukraine also welcomes the recent OHCHR thematic report focused on the impact of Russia's aggression on the rights of Ukrainian children, the first of its kind. The report provides vital, verified evidence of systematic violence, especially in territories temporarily occupied by Russia. It confirms at least 669 children killed and 1,833 injured due to Russia's use of explosive weapons in civilian areas, and documents the destruction of schools and hospitals, the militarization of children, forced implementation of Russian curricula, suspension of the Ukrainian language, and persecution of families trying to protect their children's rights to education. Particularly alarming are the forcible transfers and deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia and Belarus, the illegal change of their citizenship, and efforts to erase their Ukrainian identity. Ukraine urges all relevant UN mandates to continue the critical monitoring and reporting work. We call on the international community to act on these findings, ensuring accountability and supporting the return of deported children through initiatives such as the Bring Kids Back UA platform and the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children. On 20 March, we saw one more Kremlin's decree which provides for the forced expulsion of Ukrainian citizens living in the temporarily occupied territories and in the territory of Russia, without so-called legal grounds. Yet another step in Russia's campaign of discrimination, persecution, and forced displacement of Ukrainian citizens from their homeland or coercion to acquire the status of a foreigner. These systematic deportations and persecutions are part of Russia's policy of genocide against Ukrainian people. Responsible for the crime of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity must be brought to justice. We are grateful to all those who contribute to freeing our people from Russian captivity, both military and civilian, as well as to return Ukrainian children who were forcibly taken by the Russians. It remains our priority. Madam President, Ukraine began recording episodic cases of the use of dangerous chemical substances by the Russian troops from the beginning of the full-scale invasion, in flagrant violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, by using hazardous chemical substances. According to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, from February 2023 to February 2025, there have been recorded and documented over 6,900 cases of Russia's use of munitions containing hazardous chemicals. Over 3,400 Ukrainian servicemen have been hospitalized and with poisoning from chemicals used by the Russians. The two reports of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons emphasize that the evidence provided by Ukraine has been collected and provided to the OPCW representatives in compliance with the chain of custody and relevant procedures. Two independent OPCW-designated laboratories have confirmed that the evidence provided by Ukraine contains CS substance, which is a part of riot control agents. The situation at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains critically difficult. The Russian Federation continues to ignore the UNGA Resolution 78/316, safety and security of nuclear facilities of Ukraine, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and IAEA General Conference and Board of Governors resolutions on nuclear safety and security in Ukraine. The only way to ensure nuclear safety and security is the complete withdrawal of the Russian Federation's troops and other unauthorized personnel from the ZNPP facilities, and the return of the plant to the full sovereign control of Ukraine. Madam President, Ukraine welcomes President Trump's continued efforts to end Russia's aggression against Ukraine and restore a just and lasting peace. We welcome American mediation and advancing this process. We are grateful to Saudi Arabia for hospitality and facilitation. Nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. Ukraine has already clearly demonstrated its desire for peace and its readiness to take concrete steps. But we won't accept peace at any price, as any appeasement of aggressor would only encourage it to continue attacks in the future. Ukraine has made its three principled positions clear. First, we will not recognize any temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine as Russian. Second, we will not agree to any foreign diktat regarding the structure, number, and other characteristics of the defense forces of Ukraine. Third, we will not accept any restrictions on Ukraine's sovereignty, our domestic and foreign policies, including on the choice of alliances that we would like to join. We have already demonstrated our commitment to give peace a chance, as Ukraine has agreed to the US proposal of an immediate, interim, and full 30-day ceasefire. Russia's refusal to support it is a clear evidence who is an obstacle to peace. A crucial aspect of any future peace framework is that a temporary ceasefire does not turn into a frozen conflict. Current ceasefire efforts, the results of the consultations in Riyadh on 23rd-25th March 2025, are only a measure that has to lay the foundation for permanent peace. Ukraine and the United States have agreed to a ceasefire regarding energy facilities. We believe that such a ceasefire took effect at the moment when the relevant statement was published following the Ukrainian-US meeting. Ukraine and the United States also agreed on a ceasefire in the Black Sea, which applies not only to civilian shipping but also to ports. We believe that the agreement on the sea does not extend to Russian warships. If Russian warships currently concentrated in the eastern part of the Black Sea enter our territorial waters, Ukraine will consider this as a threat and will exercise our right to self-defense. We continue working closely with our American and European partners to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace with real security guarantees for our people. Madam President, Moscow speaks of peace while launching brutal strikes almost daily on densely populated residential areas in major Ukrainian cities. Instead of making hollow statements about peace, the Russian Federation must stop bombing Ukrainian cities and end its war against civilians. Everyone should focus on Russian actions, not their statements. The coming days will be critical in determining whether Russia is serious about peace or intends to deceive the United States and the world. Any diplomacy with Moscow must be backed by sanctions, pressure, and increased support for Ukraine. To push Russian Federation toward peace, we need strong measures and decisive actions. We are ready to take the necessary steps toward peace as quickly as possible, together with the United States, Europe, and all partners. However, if Russian Federation continues attacking our energy sector, we will respond. If Russia manipulates the naval ceasefire, we will work with our partners to increase pressure. Our position will remain strong. Ukraine resists and stands firmly. We will continue to defend ourselves. To sustain this fight against aggression, we need further international support, including in arms. NATO and the EU are indispensable elements of regional security, and Ukraine is eager to become a part of them, not only as a security recipient, but as a security provider. We must establish a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine based on the principles of the UN Charter and with clear security guarantees. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. We thank our briefer, Assistant Secretary General Ms. Joyce Misuė, for the valuable information provided. The Baltic states strongly support the role of the UN agencies and volunteers providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Having visited Kiev and Odessa this February, I can personally attest to the resilience, courage, and persistence of the UN team, headed by the UNDP Resident Coordinator Matthias Schmale, and the representatives of the OCHA, UNICEF, UNHCR, and other agencies working in the very stressful and dangerous environment. Let me note, we have joined the UN Regional Refugee Response and contribute to the humanitarian needs and response plan. Madam President, Russia's war of aggression continues to cause suffering for Ukrainian people. Every single day, Russia continues its criminal actions against Ukrainian civilians, despite all the UN General Assembly resolutions, including those adopted on February 24th, and despite the Security Council resolution adopted on the same day. Since Russia's invasion, Ukraine has repeatedly expressed its taking any credible steps towards accepting the ceasefire and only keeps on raising its demands while committing further violence against civilians in Ukraine. If Russia is serious about reaching peace, it would stop murdering innocent civilians, withdraw their armed forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, and implement the UN resolutions. The recent attacks perpetrated by Russia this month further indicate that the goals in Ukraine have remained unchanged. According to the most recent OHCR report, at least 123 civilians were killed and 567 injured in Ukraine in February 2025 alone. The vast majority of civilian casualties, 94%, and damage to educational and health facilities, 94%, occurred in territory controlled by Ukraine. Russia has also continued restricting humanitarian access and thus complicating the delivery of life-saving aid to those most affected. We also fear for the fate of civilians in the temporarily occupied territories, as humanitarian access for humanitarian workers to those territories is non-existent. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, in its March report, has stated that Russian authorities committed enforced disappearances and torture as part of the widespread and systematic attack against civilian population and pursuant to a coordinated state policy. Madam President, President Putin's latest decree forcing Ukrainians in Russia or temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to leave or to receive Russian documents by September 10th is yet another example of Russia's ongoing policy of ethnic cleansing, Russification, and forced assimilation, aiming to erase Ukrainian identity and nation. This is in gross violation with the international human rights law and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Madam President, the Baltic states strongly condemns Russia's aggression against Ukraine in blatant violation of UN Charter and international law. Russia's continued attacks against civilians, including children, humanitarian workers, and medical personnel, constitute heinous war crimes. We demand full accountability for the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Launched last April, the Register of Damage for those affected by Russia's aggression enabled to work on the compensation mechanism. Furthermore, the European Court of Human Rights is dealing with over 4,000 cases against Russia related to events in Crimea, Donbass, and wider war against Ukraine. While war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide can be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, the crime of aggression can only be prosecuted by the Special Tribunal. The Baltic states have continuously advocated for a strong and effective special tribunal that would be empowered to bring justice for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, having broad cross-regional support. This March, the co-group, consisting of senior legal experts of Ukraine, 37 states, the EU and the Council of Europe have marked a significant step towards ensuring full accountability by finalizing the technical work on 3 draft documents necessary for the establishment of the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine that will now be submitted for political consideration. Impunity leads to repeated crimes. This must stop. No one from Russia's highest political and military leadership is untouchable. Accountability also forms an integral part of the comprehensive, just and lasting peace. We stand by Ukraine and reiterate a call on Russia to respect its obligations under the international law, including the UN Charter, as well as international human rights and humanitarian law. The Baltic states support efforts aimed at reaching a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter and international law. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Madam President, thank you for convening this important meeting and for giving the European Union the opportunity to take the floor. The candidate countries Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, Liechtenstein, and as well as Monaco and San Marino aligned themselves with this statement. Let me kick off, as so many others have, by thanking Assistant Secretary General Msuya for highlighting once again the dramatic humanitarian consequences of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified aggression against Ukraine. Three main points require special stressing. First, Russia must uphold international law and cease its missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's civilians, infrastructure, and densely populated areas now. While its president states Russia can agree to a limited ceasefire, its continued military actions demonstrate the exact contrary. Every day, successive deliberate attacks and aerial bombardments cause more death and destruction. Its campaign of systematic airstrikes against Ukraine's civilians and civilian critical infrastructure violates international humanitarian law and must stop immediately. We have heard from OCHA the impact on the most vulnerable households. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, these attacks are not accidental, but have been of a widespread and systematic nature. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has further documented over 12,000 civilians killed over the past 3 years, of which over 600 were children. And let me open a parenthesis to say that the gall of the Russian Federation in this room today to accuse others of a lack of conscience in the face of such brutality is both unseemly and unconscionable, and frankly shameful. For shame, for shame. There can be no impunity for these atrocities. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression and for other most serious crimes under international law. Second point, full, safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access needs to be ensured. We commend the efforts of OCHA and its humanitarian partners in providing assistance to those in need. The UN has repeatedly highlighted the challenge of reaching civilians in areas under temporary Russian occupation. This means an estimated 1.5 million people are being cut off from humanitarian aid. While it wages a war of aggression, Russia shows no concern for the well-being of civilians in the areas it temporarily occupies. In accordance with international humanitarian law, it must facilitate full, safe, rapid, and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need. As is the case for all crises around the world, the European Union and its member states will continue to contribute generously to the United Nations humanitarian response, also in Ukraine. We call on all nations to step up their support as well. The European Union remains committed to support Ukraine's repair, recover, and reconstruction in coordination with our international partners. The Ukraine Recovery Conference in July 2025, hosted by Italy, will be important in this context. Third point, the European Union reiterates its support for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the UN Charter and international law. 1 month ago, the General Assembly gave an overwhelming message to call on the aggressor to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine. 1 month ago, That was the General Assembly of the United Nations speaking. We welcome all efforts towards reaching a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and international law. We welcome the efforts of the United States and Saudi Arabia in hosting the ongoing discussions. The proposal of a ceasefire, if accepted by Russia, can be an important step in this direction. It is now for Russia to show its willingness to achieve peace. The European Union is ready to play its full part in supporting upcoming steps, together with Ukraine and other partners. As we have stressed repeatedly, there can be no negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine, and no negotiations that affect European security without Europe. In closing, Madam President, I reaffirm the European Union's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The European Union will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes and as intensely as needed to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity applicable to all nations. Thank you, Madam President.
And I thank Ambassador Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam President, Poland aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. I would like to express our gratitude to the Danish presidency for calling this timely meeting, and our appreciation to France and Panama for requesting it, as well as to ASG Msuya for her presentation. While many look forward to restoring peace for Ukraine and stability in Europe, the events of last week's, listed moments ago by the distinguished representative of Ukraine, cast a dark shadow on those hopes. Reports indicate that Russian forces launched massive attacks against Ukraine, deploying staggering number of Shahid drones, decoys, and ballistic missiles. This demonstrates that Russia, regrettably, does not seem genuinely interested in ceasing its illegal war against Ukraine, despite growing international calls for peace. Madam President, Russia disregards fundamental international norms and principles, a fact tragically evident in its ongoing attacks on Ukraine's civilian population and deliberate targeting of energy and civilian infrastructure. These actions have resulted in frequent and widespread power and heating outages, leaving millions vulnerable. Poland continues to respond to Ukraine's critical needs on a bilateral basis, including by providing vital equipment and increasing energy exports to help alleviate the suffering caused by this relentless aggression. The recent political momentum underscores Ukraine's resolve to pursue meaningful advancement towards peace negotiations. The key ingredient to unlock a peaceful future is, regrettably, still absent, and that is Russia's genuine and constructive commitment to pursuing a negotiated settlement. It must be more than a mere pause, allowing the aggressor to rearm and strike again, as it had done before. It must instead meet a number of criteria. Cease all attacks on civilian population. Be agreed with and accepted by all stakeholders, first and foremost Ukraine, but also Europe. Guarantee Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, enabling her to freely choose her leaders, control her borders, and decide upon her future integration aspirations. Addressing root causes, Madam President, is a challenge, because they lie squarely within Russian decision-making processes, when repeatedly choosing war over peace and aggression over diplomacy.